Backyard Green Films is proud to present this episode of Agri-Culture with your host, Alara Bowman. Alara and her husband Rick travel throughout the land in their teardrop trailer that they have nicknamed Maggie, bringing you stories about their travels and the people they meet. They visit farmers, ranchers, and just about anyone who loves putting their hands in the dirt or their feet in stirrups. For the past 3 years, they have been filming a documentary about heritage breed animals entitled The Holstein Dilemma, Heritage Breeds, and the Need for Biodiversity. In those travels, they have gotten to meet some very interesting people. Here's one of those interviews.
This next podcast was one of the earliest interviews that we'd ever done in our documentary travels. It was also one of the most difficult, and it's remained in that category even as our interview list has grown. It is, however, also one of the most memorable for me, and one that I still feel deeply honored to have been able to do. Her name is Temple Grandin. Yes, I have not only sat in a room with this amazing woman, but I actually got to sit down with her and talk with her on film for an hour or so. She was kind enough to come and meet with us in a hotel conference room in Fort Collins, Colorado, just outside Colorado State University. She teaches at the university there, which is also home of the USDA's germplasm facility. A quick note for those of you that weren't aware, and I was one of those before this documentary started, there's an awful lot of really important ag science being done at Colorado State University, and some pretty big names in the scientific world walk down the halls every day. When Matthew McConaughey has to do the interstellar thing to reboot life on another planet, I'm pretty sure the big guns are going to go to the basement of CSU to fill up the shopping list, even if the man does happen to teach at the University of Texas at the time. So if you haven't heard of Temple Grandin, you probably live under a rock and only come out once a year with the groundhogs. Okay, so maybe I'm teasing a bit, but she is quite famous. Here are the highlights in case you didn't know, but I'd encourage you to go to her website, Wikipedia, Amazon, and practically everywhere to find out more. What a fantastically accomplished person she is. She has a BA from Franklin Pierce College and an MS in Animal Science from Arizona State University. She has a PhD in Animal Science from the University of Illinois and teaches classes on livestock behavior and facility design at CSU. She's the subject of a movie currently showing on HBO, starring Clara Danes and Julia Ormond. It's called Temple Grandin, of course. She's an accomplished author, and her books include Thinking in Pictures, Livestock Handling and Transport, Genetics and Behavior of Domestic Animals, Guide to Working with Farm Animals, and Humane Livestock Handling. She's hit the bestseller lists with her books Animals in Translation and Animals Make Us Human. She's also a speaker in much demand. She's a consultant that works with the livestock industry on facility design, livestock handling, and animal welfare. And here's the point where I'm going to say a word that has very few positive connotations for any of us: slaughterhouse. Temple Grandin's designs are in too many countries to list here, but I'll tell you that almost half the cattle in North America go to meet their doom through a track system she's designed. Now that sounds really, really ominous, but it's really actually a good thing. She felt strongly that humane handling was important. She quantified and qualified the benefits of better processing for both the animal and the industry, and ended up revolutionizing the methodology by which we bring meat to our table. She observed the stress the animals felt and how it contributed to both difficulties in the animals and for the people who work in the plants. And as a result, she brought a more ethical technique to the end-of-life process for the animals and showed the commercial industry how that worked in their favor with handling. By the way, as we mentioned before, in the beginning of filming, we never in a million years thought that my part of the conversation might be something anyone would need to listen to, so I wasn't mic'd for this interview. You can hear a bit of the AC in the hotel in the background, but hopefully the main part you'll want to hear, Dr. Grandin herself, comes through loud and clear. So the other thing you may know about Temple Grandin is that she's autistic. She's very publicly supportive of autism, which is an often misunderstood condition. She's brought some much-needed attention to the topic and how we perceive and treat people with this diagnosis. And she is an inventor in this area, too. Look up the phrase hug machine or squeeze box if you're interested in seeing more. What an amazing brain she has. So, why was this a difficult interview for me? Dr. Grandin was not, in my experience, a flowery, fluffy type conversationalist. When she had an opinion about something, she said it plainly. When she felt strongly about something, she said it with energy. When she had no opinion about something or didn't want to talk about it, she said that too. Flat out said, "I don't know anything about that," or "I don't want to answer that." End of sentence. It's not the normal behavioral expectation, as Sheldon Cooper might say. She doesn't have that same conversational response that we might expect from, as she might say, neurotypical people, or those not autistic. There weren't necessarily all of those things in a conversation that we do to make the social relationship seem like a smooth and relaxed experience. So at some point in the interview, I found myself trying to change my perspective, to reduce the expectation that she'd react in that very touchy-feely, human societal conversational norm kind of way. It's a really, really hard thing to do. But what it does do is it makes you realize that you will need to adapt to make the other person feel comfortable, or there will absolutely be no flow at all. You're trying to shove a square peg in a round slot, and no one is better off for it. It became less important to try to establish a normal flow for my sake, and more important to listen to what she had to say. It was an amazing moment of clarity for me as I realized that this is what she'd done for the slaughter industry. Stop trying to make it do what you want or expect and let things flow. Stop trying to force behavior and just listen and observe and learn. And often it works better for everyone. Not that I'm equating our interview with slaughter, at least I hope not. It all seemed to be reflective on one of her main goals: how to find commonality of thought and the ability to relate with other animals on this planet. And why, regardless of the end goal of who might be the eater or the eaten, or whether that's a literal or a metaphorical concept, we need to treat everyone with respect during the process and let them be themselves. There's a lesson in there for us today, too, I think. Our conversation with Dr. Grandin that day mostly centered on the need for biodiversity and heritage breeds and the direction agriculture seems to be headed. That was the topic, after all. But I found myself remembering afterward that this woman has had the ability to view life from a different perspective. And both times it ended up being very much about a life truth that's important now. But we all didn't know that at the time. So maybe it's important to listen when she's passionate about this topic too. Here is the accomplished, formidable, passionate, and very intelligent Temple Grandin. So if you could please state your name and your title.
My name is Temple Grandin, and I am Professor of Animal Science at Colorado State University.
Do you raise any animals yourself?
No, I'm not. I work with lots of other people's animals, and I'm traveling constantly.
So how did you learn about heritage breeds?
Well, I've always been interested in genetics, and I've been reading about problems with gene pools getting too narrow. Years ago, I read about the cheetah going through a genetic bottleneck, and that's why they have some defects like a kink in their tail. And you can guess you don't have enough variety in the genetics. And one of the things important about some of the old breeds of livestock is its variety. So if you have a disease come in, knocks out animals, you've got other genetics to pick from. It's the same thing with plants. That's why you have the seed bank. In fact, there's a seed bank here in Fort Collins.
I'm trying to figure out which question
in my book, Thinking in Pictures, that I wrote a good number of years ago, I wrote about scientists in a seed bank that let themselves starve in a warehouse full of grain in order to save the genetics.
I believe that was Russia, Stalingrad?
That's right.
Yes.
And I wrote about that in Thinking in Pictures.
The story made me cry.
Yeah.
So how do you view the concept of biodiversity as pertinent in today's world?
Well, I think it's important to keep genetic variety. We've got crop diseases right now that have come up. There's been problems with avian influenza, it killed off a lot of laying hens, and problems with piglet porcine diarrhea disease. Food security, pure and simple. That's why it's so important to maintain heritage breeds of cattle and heritage breeds of plants.
My next, I have two questions from your TED Talk. I
Okay.
found that to be very fascinating. You said that the world needs all different kinds of minds to work together. Would you say that the same is true of types of breeds? If so, why?
Well, it's important to keep the genetic diversity. And one of the main big reasons for doing this is food security. There is some plant diseases going on right now that people are very concerned about. You have the heritage breeds of plants. You can breed the hardiness back in.
So, would you say that heritage breeds are not just a small farm issue, it might also greatly benefit industrial
in
agriculture?
order to okay, in seeds, you can have a seed bank in a building. But for animals, the only way to save these breeds is people need to raise them. Otherwise, you're not going to be saving them. Now, I think people need to be careful on trying to turn some of the heritage breeds into more modern types of cattle, because one of their value is some of the hardiness, parasite resistance, ability to live on, rough land.
Some of the farmers say that they have dual heritage animals, but they keep their flocks or their herds separate for the purpose of breeding that mixed breed. But they still have to start with two distinct herds to get those genetic traits. Is that
Well, I think it's important. I think to preserve heritage animals, you have to breed them and raise them. And I think one of their biggest values is acting as almost like a seed bank. See, seeds you can keep in vaults. Livestock you can't keep in vaults. We have to think about food security. I went to a plant science meeting recently, and I had some very interesting talks with people back in the poster room. And some of the plant scientists are very concerned about we're going to have to do more crop rotation. They won't say it out loud because of funding issues, but you get them private behind the posters, they will tell you that. And we're already starting to see a bit more crop rotation, because that's one of the things we need to do also to reduce diseases. I'm learning this much baby stuff about crops. But biodiversity is a good thing, whether it's inside your gut, in your microbiome. I've read some of that in Science and Nature. It's in the rainforest. It's diversity of plant species on a pasture rotation system. Yes, these things are really important. Heritage animals are beautiful. That's one reason for keeping them. But it's also a food security. The other thing we got to remember about livestock, because some people think, well, we ought to just get rid of the animals. But there is huge amounts of land in this country, and I have been on that land, both in the U.S. and in Australia. Last fall, I went to the Australian outback. We got on a plane in Darwin, a little small propeller plane, flew 2.5 hours over nothing, then get to like an 800 square mile cattle station. You cannot grow crops in the outback. There is not enough water. There's just enough water that you can raise cattle. So you got this huge, gigantic area of land, the size of the whole middle of the U.S., and the only way you can raise food on it is grazing animals of various types. There's no other way. I think we have to raise food on that land. We got to do it in a responsible manner.
This is one thing I would like to ask you about. I watched your TED Talk, and you talk about autism and how that some of the characteristics in autism have allowed you to see things that other people might not.
Well, I'm an extreme visual thinker. And I was just talking about some different pigs that I had seen side by side in pens. And when I talk about those pigs, I'm seeing them. You see, my memory is specific pictures. Most people think in words, and it's much more general. Also, if you want to understand animal behavior, animals don't think in words. They think in pictures. They think in sounds. They think in smells. And then there's emotions, attached to those images or those smells.
But you are very good at observation, correct?
Well, I find a lot of people, you can train people in observation, but some people are about it better than others. I have a slide that I show in many of my talks of an animal looking at a sunbeam. And I'll talk about things that will distract the cattle. Coats on fences, hoses on the ground, reflections on water. I'll talk about that. Then I'll show the picture of the calf looking at the sunbeam on the floor. And I'll say, how many of you see it? If I show that slide to elementary school children, over half of all the kids will put their hand up. I show that slide to most other audiences, livestock and non-livestock audiences, I might get 10% of the hands.
So, in many ways, if the heritage animal requires potentially less maintenance, which is what we understand from many of the farmers, they either have very easy cattle.
Well, basically, most of your older type breeds are more hardy. They can survive on more sparse pastures and sparse conditions, maybe more parasite, more disease resistant. There's always trade-offs when you breed an animal. You over-select for any single trait, you will wreck your animal. It doesn't matter if it's an appearance trait or a production trait. And the bulldog's a very good example, ruining an animal strictly for an appearance trait. You kept selecting more and more and more for smushed in face and shaped like this, and it can't walk, it can't have its babies naturally, and it can barely breathe.
And it's my understanding that behavior and temperament are also selected for in our farming system, correct?
Well, in the process of domestication, you are basically, when you domesticate an animal, what you're basically doing is selecting for calmer individuals. I had a very interesting experience recently in New Zealand. I went out to a deer farm. It was interesting to see how the deer acted now compared to 30 to 35 years ago when I went to New Zealand. They were larger and they were also much tamer. 35 years ago, to handle deer, you had to do it inside a dark building with just a little tiny nightlight on. Now you can go in an open pen that's open to the sky and be right in there with deer. They'd be jumping on top of you and crashing off the walls 35 years ago. That's the process of domestication starting.
But potentially, when you select for some characteristics, you may inadvertently lose others, correct?
There's always trade-offs. There's always trade-offs when you're selecting for an animal. And if I just single-mindedly select for production, I probably will lose some other traits. You've got to look at your whole animal. One example is leg conformation issues in pigs and cattle. As we have selected, just selecting for carcass traits and growth traits. There are some leg problems like crooked claw in cattle, too straight, collapsed ankles. The pig industry made mistakes with that in the 80s. They have corrected some of those mistakes now. I want to make sure that cattle don't repeat some of those same mistakes. So we need to be looking at the whole animal. And the problem you've got is if the only animals you look at are the animals that you breed, and they change slowly, you don't see it. And one of the reasons why I saw some of these problems years ago in the pigs is because I would go to the meat plant, and you might have pigs there from 20 different farmers. Each farmer's pig's in a different pen. And I'd go through the pens and I'd shake the gate. And these new hybrids were very, very flighty, and they would jump up and squeal. Next pen of pigs wouldn't even get up. I could look at the legs between different pigs. And some of the geneticists would say, well, you're not qualified to talk about this because you're not a genetics expert. I said, I have one qualification you don't have. I've seen more pigs from more different sources all in one place beside each other than you have ever seen. Because if you only see your own animals, bad can become normal. And bad can become normal and you don't even realize it.
So specifically, when you have a disease like the pig disease, how specifically might a scientist or a farmer introduce a different species to try and...
Okay, you get one, it's hard to say. Right now, science is learning so much about genetics. I mean, 50 years in the future, we can probably write genetic code. But there's still going to be unique traits we may not be able to write. It'd be sort of like if you lose ancient literature. Even though we know how to write now, you're never going to get that ancient literature back. Even if we completely know how to do, Microsoft design an animal and just start designing all kinds of animals, there'll still be ancient old code that we don't figure out how to write. If you lost the Greek classics, I don't think somebody today is going to be writing those.
So it's something that if we have the material, we can rebuild it. If we have the ingredients to a cake, we can remake the cake. But if it's all mixed together, it's hard to make the cake a little
Well,
different.
the problem you have, even when we get to the point where we actually can write, like program in genetic code, we don't know how to do that yet. We're just copying it. And we know which bits and pieces do different things. But eventually, be able to just design different kinds of animals way, way, way far in the future. There still is code that might be in that heritage breed that we wouldn't think to write of.
So you have an interesting perspective because you're very familiar with the industrial model and the small farms model. Would you explain your experience with those, please?
Well, I try to get experience on a lot of different things. In many different fields, people just stay inside their own box. I think it's important to go back and forth between different boxes. In fact, a big emphasis right now in science is interdisciplinary. Like, for example, the computer science people need to do some electrical engineering. But there's also forces to keep them inside the box. I read a discouraging study that was done on grants from the Australian scientific organization, the CSIRO. And when the grant involved different disciplines, it was less likely to get funded than a grant within a discipline. But oftentimes, breakthroughs in science are made when you go across disciplines.
Pure research.
Yeah, I'm talking about pure research.
So, I have some questions for you that are more generally farm-oriented, but they might apply in your experience to animals in general. So, do you think that the public knows the difference between an industrial and a heritage breed?
You have certain breeds of animals where you get a narrow gene pool. Okay, a natural example is the cheetah. They got into a natural bottleneck, not enough biodiversity. Cheetahs have got some definite problems. Now, there's a tendency with both plants and animals raised on large-scale agriculture to get just a few genetic lines. Now, the big value of some of the so-called heritage breeds is their biodiversity. And if a disease was ever to come in, and there are diseases that have hit both livestock and plants, that's when everybody's going to be thanking the person who's raising heritage animals for saving that gene bank.
So this says to me that the breed directory that the Conservancy does is probably one of the biggest tools, because you can contact breeders for your breed in bizarre, out-of-the-way places and still have that.
And then you can get semen, and I think using semen in some cases is a good thing to do because you don't spread diseases around. And you can use semen from some faraway place and keep diversity. That's important. That's also done in zoo animals. They keep breed registries on zoo animals to make sure tigers or whatever they have are not getting too narrow.
Healthy genetic stock within the breed still.
You don't want to get too inbred because you're going to get trouble. Also, over-select for any production, appearance, or behavior trait, you will wreck your animal. In the original Bellier foxes, they selected for temperament. They ended up getting a calm, stocky, kind of neotenized border collie fox dog, and then they overdid it, and they got epilepsy. And I'm concerned right now, in yellow Labrador that's being bred for service dog, they're getting epilepsy in these dogs because they are breeding for a super, super calm temperament. I talked to a blind lady who had to retire 2 golden labs at 5 or 6 years old because they got seizures. Obviously, you can't have that in a guide dog. They were selecting for super calm temperament. You overdo it, you're going to get trouble. Or people think it's pretty to have blue-eyed animals. You put 2 of those together and you get deafness and Dalmatians. No, this is not okay.
So, can you describe how you think that heritage breeds and genetic diversity and the temperament in some of these animals might help to support animal welfare?
Well, the important thing in a lot of the different types of livestock that came off of rugged environments is hardiness. Parasite resistance, disease resistance, They're smaller, they eat less, so they can live on more rugged land. Okay, we breed an animal to be more and more productive. You also are breeding an animal that has to eat more. It's not going to do very well on rugged land. I'm very concerned about diseases in crops right now. I went to a crop science meeting recently, and back in the poster room in private, I talked to a lot of crop scientists. They're very concerned about things getting too much monoculture and the need to diversify and rotate crops a lot more. They all will tell you that in private. Publicly, not so much. They're worried about their funding. Preserving rare breeds is important. We've had a pig disease come blasting through here, an avian influenza, and lost an awful lot of animals. In the future, we may need some of those heritage breeds. We may need that hardiness of that genetics. It's very, very important to preserve the unique genetics in these animals.
So if you were a farmer and you had to make a living raising animals, would you choose heritage breeds?
Well, I was a farmer. It depends upon where I was at, what kind of circumstances I was in. I really like the idea of raising them. Probably raise some regular cattle too, but raise a few of the heritage animals, because I have a definite philosophy that preserving rare genetics is important.
So you believe in it as an ethical concept, or is that correct?
Well, I believe in it. Saving rare genetics is the right thing to do.
So would you call heritage breeds a past or a future concept, or both?
It's important to save diverse, different kinds of genetics. They're beautiful animals, a lot of them. A lot of people raised all these beautiful different kinds of cattle and pigs and horses and all these different animals. They didn't know anything about genetics. They basically just took what they liked and they put it together. And a lot of the cattle have distinct color patterns because that's how they identified the breed, back when they didn't know genetics. There's some wheat diseases now. Another one that's self-interest is the banana. The Cavendish banana, the yellow banana. There's a disease that's destroying a lot of yellow bananas. We got citrus greening right now. It's destroying citrus. Now, another way you might be able to fix some of these problems is genetic engineering. But you have to know what to genetically engineer, and that goes back to pieces of code that may be in heritage animals or in heritage crops.
Is there anything that you think that people should know about these breeds that you haven't discussed?
I think it's important. Unique breeds of animals, all different kinds of animals. It's important to save them, because if you lose that genetics, you have lost it. And the only way you can preserve unique genetics in animals is you have to raise them.
In our self-interest.
It is our self-interest.
If you liked our podcast, please subscribe. This is how we keep going. And please tell your friends to join us. Please feel free to post any questions or comments that you might have to our social media sites. Our Twitter feed is at Backyard Green Films, spelled BKYRDGREENFILMS. Our Instagram is at Backyard Green Films, BACKYARDGREENFILMS. Our Facebook is Backyard Green Films. Our YouTube URL is youtube.com/backyardgreentv.
We want to thank Temple Grandin for joining us today, and what a great honor it was to have her on our show. For more information about Temple Grandin and her work, please visit her website at templegrandin.com. You have been listening to Agri-Culture with your host, Alara Bowman. Please tune in for more upcoming episodes from our travels. We'd also like to thank our producer, Michelle Council. I'm Rick Bowman, your behind-the-scenes editor. Until next time. This has been a presentation of Backyard Green Films Productions, all rights reserved, copyright 2019.